it is best if your audience is not your number one source of validation, because that creates the thing that you described earlier, which is that constant cycle of escalation as you feel more and more emboldened to be more and more reckless in how you express yourself. Again, I understand that just listening to the way that I'm phrasing things, right, looking at how you express yourself, caring about a brand image, etc., it sounds really restrictive, which might grate on a lot of people. But again, it all circles back to, do you want to be paid to do this? And if the answer is yes, then these are all things that you're going to have to be thinking about at some point.
Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of Chewing the Vtubing, a show interviewing Vtubers, artists, riggers with interesting content creation journeys and skill sets. Today's guest is Armchair expert, a media analysis and PR commentary channel on a mission to help Vtubers and Vtuber corporations avoid self-destruction by promoting ethical conduct and best practices. Armchair was first made famous by his breakdown of Niji Sanji's manipulative PR strategy and the smear campaign against Vtubers such as Salantatsky and Zion.
About a month ago, I released a video where I took the knowledge gained from 4 years at media school and used it to break down the nightmarish PR strategy employed by Niji Sanji in their termination of Salantatsky, aka Doki Bird. This was a corporate PR strategy so unethical, so incompetent, and so disastrous that the fallout from it breached containment and made it into mainstream news.
He also deconstructs a wide range of topics in an academic manner, such as Twitch's apparent vendetta against VTubers, general VTuber advice, and sometimes philosophy. In this episode, I'll be asking Armchair questions on the major do's and don'ts of conduct on social media, inspired by some of the VTuber meltdowns we've seen during the US presidential season. If you enjoyed today's commentary, you can find Armchair's channel in the description. Please make sure you subscribe. We've seen many, I think, poorly handled announcements from VTuber corporations this year. It's also the first US presidential election we've had since VTubing became mainstream in the West, which has led to some potentially career-ending comments and outrage.
It's been a real joy to watch unfold, yeah.
It's, there's been some, unfortunately, mask-off moments and a bit of some worrying behaviors from VTubers who honestly should probably know a bit better than they do. I think most people realize that the best practice when you're conducting yourself on the internet is to avoid politics in any form. You don't endorse anyone or any party. You don't comment on world events. I mean, unless you are a political content creator, then that would make sense, right? So you've made a flowchart about when to post something on your socials and when to close the app, which is quite good. I quite like it. So tell us why we should follow your little flowchart. What are the consequences if we don't?
Essentially, all this flowchart is supposed to do is remind creators that if they're going to post something, if they're going to say something publicly, then it is best practice that they think about it, that they go about it as if they have a target audience, right?
Yeah.
And if they don't want to think about a target audience, then my question would be, why are you posting this publicly? Now, the main thing that, well, the reason why I made this flowchart, and it was specifically tailored to Twitter, people who use Twitter. Mm-hmm. The reason why I made it is because the thing about the way that Twitter is designed as a platform is that your tweets are shown to people outside of your niche or regular audience. The whole point of the platform is to expose you to new people who may or may not share your values, opinions, and assessment of situations. And unless you're ready to accept that fact, you open yourself up to quite a bit of, quite a bit of unpredictable backlash, I suppose, from audiences that you were never prepared for, well, audiences that you didn't anticipate reading your stuff. So, I mean, the first bifurcation in this particular flowchart is just asking the most simple of questions, which is being really honest with yourself about who you are making this post for, right? And the thing that I find is quite difficult to convey to people is if you are writing a tweet for yourself and nobody else, Twitter is objectively the worst place you can put that particular thought or sentiment. Because again, the app is designed to turn personal thoughts, experiences, struggles, stories into public melees. So unless you are fine with that, unless you have an audience that you're okay with, turning your personal, expression into something, a shit flinging contest or whatever, I would just advise that, first be honest with yourself about who you're doing this for. And if it is just for yourself, just put those thoughts somewhere else, right? Vent it to a friend, write it in a journal. It doesn't actually matter where else you put it, as long as you don't put it in a public space. However, if you're okay with making it public, if you're okay with putting that tweet out there because you do have a target audience in mind, then you're going to have to ask yourself, is that audience going to listen to you? If the answer is no, then you probably don't want to simply put your thoughts out there. You probably just want someone to listen and validate you, listen to you and validate how you're feeling, which means that a journal probably wouldn't cut it, but venting to a friend probably will, because that way you get the sort of, you affirm the fact that someone is listening to your thoughts, feelings, whatever. And you also gain, it's a safe place to do that. It's a safe person to vent to. Twitter is not a safe person to vent to. And then if you're targeting an audience that is going to listen to you, right? Best case scenario, then you're going to have to ask yourself, okay, you're going to have to factor in the way that Twitter is designed as a platform. Am I okay with audiences outside of my target audience seeing what I've said? If the answer is, the way that I phrased it was, do I mind if people outside of that audience see my tweet? And if the answer is yes to that, right? If you don't want people outside of your target audience to see it, then it's probably a good time to either, delete the post, close the app, or if you really, really need to get it out there, get someone to reword it so that even if someone sees it even if someone outside of a usual audience sees it, they'll probably understand it. But even in those cases, you can't guarantee that said audience is going to interpret your words the way that you meant them. If you've gone through all of those hoops, right? If you've concluded that you are writing a tweet for a target audience that is going to listen to you, but you also don't mind if audiences outside of that see what you've written, then the final check is just making sure that it's consistent with how you want people to see you. If the answer is no, then it's time to delete the app. There's no saving the tweet. Because, and this is something that I have said before, and it is quite a difficult thing to, I suppose, beat into the minds of a lot of creators. But when you put yourself onto the internet, no matter how personal your reasons for becoming a creator, you must accept that when you are creating content for an audience, because of the constraints of the platform you're using to communicate with your audience, you are turning yourself into a product. And that also involves forming a personal brand. When you erode that personal brand, when you give your audience something that will shatter their immersion so completely that they are no longer capable of viewing you in the same light as they did before, you've shot yourself in the foot. So if your tweet, as you've written it, erodes or even worse, destroys a part of your brand, then I would advise against posting it. Because, well, then it all circles back to why are you making this tweet, right? Why do you want to make this thought, feeling, public. And if it's just emotional validation, there are better places to get that than Twitter. But if you've gone through all of those hoops, all of those checks, and you've decided, okay, this is fine, this works, this synergizes with my brand, what I would like, it synergizes well, it reinforces how I would like other people to see me, then by all means, just send it. But the main objective of all of this, asking yourself all of these questions, jumping through all of these hoops, is to make sure that you are, not only that you mean what you're saying in the way that you phrased it, but that you are okay with the possibility of people outside of your usual audience misinterpreting what you've said as well. Because that is always a risk that you need to account for when you're using a public platform to express something, especially if that something is intensely personal while also being somewhat divisive or possibly somewhat divisive. And it is honestly quite mind-blowing how often I see creators, mostly indie, but occasionally corpo, come out with statements that are received badly by just general audiences on Twitter, but received badly in a way that could have been easily predicted if they just left that tweet in the drafts for about an hour or so. And the thing that I want to reinforce to a lot of creators is, if you delay your tweet, and I'm assuming this isn't something like responding to an allegation or something like that, because at that point you need to be thinking a bit more seriously about how you phrase things, right? This isn't an off the cuff kind of thing.
Right.
But assuming it's not as serious as that, if you just wait 1, 2, 3, sometimes 6 to 12 hours before posting an opinion on something, that opinion is not going to become any less relevant to your audience. Your audience is not going to become any less invested in your opinion, in your thoughts. They are still going to, they're still going to pay attention. But in waiting that long between writing it out and posting it, you've given yourself time to sort of, if there are emotions running high, to sort of wind down a little bit and evaluate what you've written in a bit more of an objective light. And that can be the difference between eroding your brand completely or keeping it consistent. And I get that a lot of creators might hear what I just said and think, oh, okay, that's a really cynical way of viewing what I'm doing. I don't want to think about, VTubing in that way. But, and to be fair, if you approach VTubing as just a hobby, that's fine. But if you want to be paid to be a VTuber, and I mean paid as in like either through support from your viewers or through a small wage or salary by a corpo at some point in the future, if that is your goal, then I would advise people to start thinking about things like their brand, their image, how they come across to audiences that they don't even have as part of their community just yet.
I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? I think for some people, the problem is with social media, obviously, particularly if you've got a big fan base, having all those likes, retweets, having those fans always kind of validate you, no matter what you do, it can cause people to, I guess, lose their inhibitions and do something that they perhaps might regret. Do you have any advice maybe that you'd give to VTubers as well to kind of help them not lose those inhibitions and make sure that they stay on the straight and narrow?
And this is going to sound a little harsh, but I would advise creators to make sure that their audiences are not their largest source of validation. That if they want to feel affirmed or validated with regards to how they feel about something, that they go to a friend that they can talk to offline for that.
Yep.
And then have their audience as maybe the second, third, fourth largest source of validation in their life. And I understand that as much of a meme as it is in this space, I understand that might be a bit of a tall order for some people, especially those who go to VTubing as a way of making friends, as a way of socializing.
Yep.
In which case, if I'm being completely honest, not exactly from my own experience and from hearing horror stories from other people, I'm not sure this industry is the best place for that.
Yeah.
But but I mean, yeah. It is best if your audience is not your number one source of validation, because that creates the thing that you described earlier, which is that constant cycle of escalation as you feel more and more emboldened to be more and more reckless in how you express yourself. Again, I understand that just listening to the way that I'm phrasing things, right? Looking at how you express yourself, caring about a brand image, etc., it sounds really restrictive, which might grate on a lot of people. But again, it all circles back to, do you want to be paid to do this? And if the answer is yes, then these are all things that you're going to have to be thinking about at some point. Actually, I wanted to sort of add on something specifically to do with the discussion of politics as well.
Go ahead.
A lot of people seem to follow this line of thinking where there are only two approaches towards politics. One being, don't talk about it at all. And two being all out emotional, I hate your side. If you are on the other side, I don't want you anywhere near me or my audience, Don't talk to me or my child ever again, that kind of thing. But I do think that there is a middle ground that is a little underrated, and that is, well, it's not even that particular to politics, but simply, when you are going to discuss things, one, make sure that you've created a context for yourself to discuss them in a way that makes sense to your audience. You don't want to just come in at them out of nowhere. But once you have that context set up, you don't have to talk about partisan politics, or you don't have to talk about politics in a partisan manner. You can simply talk about the values you hold as a person or as a creator. For example, if you want to talk about things like being against identity politics, not liking how politics seems to be devolving into a team sport. That is technically a political perspective, but that's not really partisan in the way that you've expressed it. And I do think that is a way of, it's a nice way of breaking out of the sort of, team sportification that politics is currently undergoing, which makes it a really divisive topic. I don't think a lot of creators are exploring that much when they do insist on talking about politics. And the second thing I wanted to add on was, and this is specifically to do with VTubers on the EN side, when they talk about politics, the overwhelming majority of EN VTubers, from what I've seen, when they randomly start talking about politics, and I say randomly as in, it's not their usual content.
Right.
It's almost always VTubers who are talking about the American election or living in similarly democratic societies. And the thing that I want to sort of emphasize here is, I don't think a lot of creators realize that if you live in a democratic society and you want to involve yourself in politics, right? Not just vent your feelings about politics, but actually move the needle to any degree, and you live in a democratic society, the more democratic your society is, the less suited content creators are to doing the job of politicians. And the reason for that is, in democracy, the way that politics works is that it is a game to see who can alienate the least demographics. In other words, who has the widest appeal. That is the job of a politician. They have to be able to, and again, this is the job of anyone who wants to actually affect politics in a democracy.
Absolutely.
They have to figure out how to appeal to as many groups of people at the same time as possible, which necessitates forming alliances with different groups of people who may share different perspectives, different values, different opinions to yourself. And that is the opposite of what a content creator is seeking to do when they communicate with an audience. Because a content creator instead of wanting to make their appeal as broad and wide as possible, or at least, you know, when they're in the beginning to middle stages of their career, a content creator is looking to create their ideal community just as much as they're looking to create content, right? I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that a content creator's biggest achievement, right up there with their content, is their community, right? The community you build for yourself is part of your identity as a content creator. However, what that also means is, as a content creator continues to build up an audience, over time, what they end up doing is, intentionally or unintentionally, they start pruning down that audience to fit their ideal community. And that's natural. That's a normal part of being a content creator.
Chat reflects the streamer, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Chat reflects the streamer. And if you don't, if you don't moderate, gatekeep, whatever, your audience at all, then you end up with a mess of a community. And no content creator wants that. So as a result, you get into the situation where the more democratic your society is, the less suited content creators are to doing the job of politicians. And so, if you are a content creator and you actually want to affect political change, if I see a content creator that says that they want to make an impact, they have people that they think are threatened under the new regime or the new people in charge of a democratic society, and their approach towards affecting politics is to alienate either a section of their community or to blanket, basically to spray acid in the general direction of, audiences that haven't even been defined yet. That is a self-defeating move, always. Because in choosing to preemptively alienate different groups of people who may have different opinions or values or perspectives to yourself, you are essentially shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to actually affecting any sort of political change in your democratic society. So if that is the case, right? If you live in a democratic society and if that is your default approach towards politics, then there are one of two things that you're going to have to confront. Either you don't really like democracy that much, and to be fair, I think that's I myself am not. I do think that democracy is a very flawed system as well. But either that's the case, or if you really do think and believe in the democracy, all of its values, its functionality, etc., you care more about your own emotional catharsis than actually affecting any kind of social, political change.
Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
That's a good way of putting it, I suppose. If you really want to affect political change, and you live in a democracy, or you're talking about a democracy, don't express that by saying something like, for example, fuck your immersion, or unfollow me if you XYZ, or I don't want you, I don't want you if you believe in XYZ, if you voted for XYZ, or whatever. Because that's not how democracies work.
It's quite sad as well, actually. Funnily enough, there are some content creators who I quite like who have had those meltdowns on Twitter, and I'm normally quite forgiving and patient with people who have these episodes. But with what's been going on recently, I've unsubscribed, I've unfollowed, I've gone, okay, yeah, fine, I will then. As you say, if you want me to, I will unfollow you. And obviously that doesn't help them in any way, does it? It's just reduced their audiences. It's alienated people who would before give them money and support. So it's of no benefit to their career whatsoever.
I mean, at the end of the day, they can probably pat themselves on the back a little bit and celebrate the fact that they got rid of X and Y unscrupulous, dirty, whatever so-and-so supporter, right?
Yeah.
But there's a very thin line between safe spaces and echo chambers.
Yes.
And if your default approach is to advocate for alienating people that might just disagree with you on a few things, but would probably align with you in quite a lot of ways outside of politics, you risk sort of cocooning yourself into you risk building up, you risk locking yourself into an echo chamber, right? Even though you might say or think that you're creating a safe space.
What's the most common social media mistake that you see VTubers commit? What really, tears your hair out?
Oh, that's a good question. There are a lot.
I can imagine.
If I could snap my fingers and have one thing fundamentally change about all VTubers, it would be getting rid of the belief that Twitter is a good substitute for a therapist or a friend or a personal journal. If I could change just one thing about VTubers en masse, it would be that perspective on Twitter, that habit of that habitual use of Twitter as somewhere where they can go to be vulnerable, to vent their personal frustrations, to talk about how they're feeling about something. And that's not necessarily because, if you're that's not because, if you're going through something personal, you should never share it with other people. No, that's not what I'm driving at. It's more to do with the fact that more often than not, when I see people sharing things that are intensely personal, you can kind of tell that they're doing it with the intention of getting some sort of emotional affirmation or validation. And Twitter can provide that, but it is far more likely to provide literally anything else. I mean, an example that we've been given of this over the past few months is when Fruit from Vshoujo posted a Google Doc outlining her experiences with her abusive ex-husband.
Oh yes, right, yeah.
Yeah. And again, this was something that's intensely personal for her. And when she posted it, the initial response was all like, love, positivity, etc., etc. And that was probably what she was, aiming for. But then afterwards, you had these completely unrelated accounts coming in and bringing up some pretty, again, tying this back to other things she's done in the past, I do think are right to criticize.
Yep.
Admittedly, like for example, her involvement during the Hogwarts Legacy thing. But not only so, again, what ended up happening was after that initial sympathetic audience found that tweet, everyone else found it as well. And this included people who were going to not view this as its own isolated instance of vulnerability or anything, but then place it in a canon of her previous behaviors, mistakes, etc. as well. And also, you had these accounts that were ratioing her tweet by essentially just, making jokes about cheating, etc., etc., which I'm quite certain was not what the intended response was supposed to be. And the thing is, if you're going to post something intensely personal onto a website that is probably, most likely, statistically speaking, it's going to yield some sort of response that you didn't intend, you can still come out on top, or you can still come out as a net neutral at the very least, if you simply ignore all of the responses that you didn't intend to elicit. But the problem is, someone else from Vshoujo responded to responded to the negativity, and that's where things got messy.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you read through the document, it said that this was something that she'd been debating on posting for an extended period of time. I forget, I think it was a year or something. And I mean, she had a year to sit on this document. And anyone anyone, anyone, their mum and their dog could have told her, look, you are going to get quite a bit of support when you post this, but you are probably going to get a lot more negative responses when you post this.
Absolutely.
And that to me says one of two things. Either she didn't share this at all with literally anybody else who is either part of her agency or a friend or something along those lines, or she did and none of them warned her that this was going to happen, because this was one of the most predictable outcomes of her doing this.
No, I think you're
for
right.
a number of reasons. But yeah, and it's one of those things where, again, it was intensely personal, but it was just posted to an audience that was more likely than not going to dunk on it as anything but, right?
Yep.
And I don't know how to phrase this instead of, aside from just, it's sort of this, if you're going to post something like that on Twitter, you are going to have to make some hard choices before you do so. You are either going to have to accept and have the fortitude to ignore any attempts at interpreting it in a way that you didn't intend. Or, and this is going to sound harsh, I would just advise against posting anything that personal entirely. Because if you post it and then you acknowledge the negative responses, now you've shot yourself in the foot. You're bleeding in shark-infested waters. And it's never a good place to be. And all of this can be avoided if we simply moved away from the belief that Twitter is somehow a safe space to share things in general. I think there was there was a reply that said something along the lines of, if this was the way that everyone used Twitter, then all the site would be promos and plushies. And I thought about that and I was like, okay, yeah, no, I agree with that assessment, but is that really a bad thing? Because, well, I mean, I guess that depends, right?
Mm.
Twitter is not the place you want to go if you have something very personal you want to get off your chest. If you're not willing to close your heart and mind to all of the possible negative outcomes and responses that might flood in after you post something personal, then I would highly advise you to take whatever you were about to post somewhere else, preferably online. Preferably offline.
Yeah.
But yeah, most common social media mistake by far, viewing Twitter as a substitute for a therapist, a friend, or a journal.
No, quite. I think you're right. When I think about how some VTubers or just content creators in general use Twitter, I think with VTubing in particular, parasocialism is a big element of VTubing. Obviously, with the whole, I guess, kind of idol culture, the Oshi culture, fans of a VTuber get very seriously, I guess, engaged and interested, not just in the, I guess, the sort of face that the VTuber presents, but they want to know more and more and support the actual person behind the VTuber avatar. And then sometimes that can go, I guess, that can get a bit too obsessive into the person. And I think
For sure.
Yeah, I think that sometimes there's almost, would you say that maybe there's perhaps a calculated play from VTubers who know that if they have these, I guess, therapy sessions in public, that will endear their fans to them more and gain them more followers, perhaps gain a bit more devotion and support.
I would agree with that. That is definitely something that does happen in this space. More often than not, I do think that, especially once you get to a certain degree of visibility and size as a creator, you can pretty reliably count on other creators of similar size or smaller size coming in to express support as well.
Yeah.
But one thing that I do end up seeing as well is creators who accidentally or intentionally start using their audiences as this sort of their sort of emotional receptacle, where they will just they won't have, they won't bother processing things before they share it with their audience. So it'll just essentially be a therapy session, except instead of a qualified professional in front of you or a friend in front of you, it's just going to be a CCV in front of you.
Yes.
And I don't think that's good for either the audience or the creator in question. If it becomes a habit, like if it happens a few times, if it's, if you know what you're doing, for want of a better phrase, sure, I guess that works. If your audience is open to that kind of thing, sure, I guess that works. But in general, I do find that I have, and this might very much be, this might be a negativity bias on my end, where I only tend to note the more egregious instances of this happening. But I do tend to notice that it starts to become a little concerning, worrying, unhealthy, more often than not. Although, again, like I said, possible negativity bias in the way that I'm seeing things.
No, that makes sense. I think as well, I think VTubers don't necessarily consider, I guess, the dangers of what they're doing as well. You've got people, I think, sometimes basically openly declaring to the world on Twitter all their health issues, essentially, all their very, confidential, personal to them physical and mental health issues, which is a bit shocking to say the least. I think it can kind of backfire as well, because I consider myself to be a somewhat empathetic person. And so when I see these, threads from people who are, VTubers who are perhaps always suffering with depression or things in their life, aren't going too well, and it seems like almost every communication that we get from them is almost like a twit longer of everything bad going on in their life. It's not a nice thing to read, really, particularly when I've just come back from, when I've come back from work. I hate to make it, sound like I don't care or make it sound like myself, but it's a very depressing to read, and it can actually be quite a turn off as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you pointed out, right, when you just say this, especially if you're saying it directed at one particular person, it sounds callous. But I do think in general, if there is, in terms of messages that I would like to put out into VTubing as an industry in general, or even just, content creation in general, I do think it is very worth remembering that your audience is not some sort of bottomless bleeding heart, where they will have an infinite amount of fucks to give, for want of a better way of phrasing it, about what happens in your life in addition to whatever they're coping with in theirs. Understanding that there is a limit to the compassion of others is a very underrated trait online. I don't even just mean in VTubing, I mean online in general.
Yeah.
There's actually a term that we have for this, which I've brought up on one of my streams before, called compassion fatigue,
Yes.
which is quite literally when your ability to empathize, sympathize, feel for another person is exhausted, burnt out, because of how much negative news you have accidentally consumed over a short period of time. And the thing is, compassion fatigue is not necessarily constrained by the time frame that you consume that content in. It can be specific to a certain creator or a certain source, for example. When you look at the way the compassion fatigue works in news readerships, for example, if a particular, if enough things are going wrong in a reader's life, and in addition to that, maybe let's say a specific publication that they usually get their news from is also constantly reporting on negative things, they might just take that particular publication out of their media consumption habits entirely, for at least for a little while, just to give themselves room to recover, right? Because again, even though the bad things aren't happening to you, it is human to empathize, sympathize, feel for other human beings when you hear or see them going through bad things. And a lot of the times people don't get to control that, right? They'll read about, for example, like you said, right, someone just feeling depressed, or someone not being able to get out of bed, or someone going through a really rough patch in their life. And the thing is, it sounds callous, but if as a creator you burn out your audience with bad things that are happening to you, there is going to eventually be a limit to how much they can feel for you. And again, it's a very grim thing to have to think about, especially when you're going through it and you just want some sort of support emotionally. You want some sort of validation, affirmation, whatever. But it's just a fact. It's just how people operate. Online, offline, it's all the same. We all have a limited amount of compassion to give. And if you burn someone out of that, they are probably going to just disengage for at least a little bit.
You're absolutely right. And I think as well, going back to what you said before, again, it might sound callous, but ultimately content creators, VTuber or otherwise, we're products. We're here to entertain or inform or whatever people, that's do the funny man, or shut up, basically, right?
I will say though, because I realize, thinking back on what I just said, I do think that there is a middle ground between simply, venting your frustrations to your audience and not saying anything at all and keeping it all inside. Because I do think that for some creators, in some cases, keeping it all pent up inside is, probably not the healthiest thing to do. I do think that an underrated middle ground is, well, this is actually quite similar to bringing up problems in the workplace, right? No one likes to hear about a problem that can't be solved. And the thing is, I think a very underrated way of going through your problems, and this is kind of, this kind of requires you to sort of process things that are happening in your own life before you share them with your audience, at least to some extent.
Yes.
But if you are going to share something with your audience, I do think that it is worth thinking about when your audience chooses to watch you, they are making an investment in you as a creator, not just with their money, but with their time. And naturally, when anyone invests anything in, whenever someone invests their resources in anything, they want to be reassured that they've made a good investment, that the investment is going to stick around for a while. And again, this is yet another example of a bit of a cynical way of looking at VTubing for some people. But you want to be able to assure your audience that they are making a safe investment. And an underrated part of, sharing things like emotional struggles or whatever is showing your audience that there is a way to get out of it, that you are aware that there is a way to get out of it, right?
Yeah.
Where, and I don't mean just, ask for money or anything. No, that's generally not a good move. But even if it's something like, expressing a bit of pluckiness in the face of difficulty, because that's always nice to see, right? When you're just a viewer stuck behind a screen watching somebody who you actually have come to talk about how shit their life is, it is nice if at the end of all of that they are capable of, they express that it's not a dead end, they're not going to disappear, the content's not going to get worse or whatever, and they express that they have some sort of fortitude that you can add to, rather than simply trying to act as support for a foundation that isn't there, I suppose is the way that I would put it.
I mean, that's a big part of why my Kamiyoshi is my Kamiyoshi. You're absolutely right.
Your Kamiyoshi is Lumi, right?
That's right.
Yeah, based. But yeah, no, if you're going to express something to your audience, I would recommend going for the middle ground, right? It doesn't have to be like a hardcore solution like you would have to bring in a workplace, right? Where you tell your boss, oh, I've noticed that something in our processes is awful, here's how you fix it, otherwise not bringing it up at all, or something like that. But right. But at least express to your audience that you are going to get through it. You're not going to give up. You're not going to disappear off the face of the earth tomorrow. It's not going to get the better of you. Again, something that I do find is a little underrated is the whole concept of leading by example.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
If you want your audience to come to your defense when there are other people attacking you, you need to be able to stick up for yourself, your own opinions, etc., etc. Same thing applies to when you want support from your audience regarding something that's happening to you in real life, a crisis that's going on in real life, where your audience doesn't want to. And I say this as a bit of a generalization, but I think it's true often enough to the point where I can just refer to it as a fact. Your audience doesn't want to be used as a crutch. They would rather be part of a movement. Everyone wants to be part of something greater, right?
Yep.
And so that is what leading by example gives, right? You give them a foundation to build on with their support. If you give even a slight flicker, a little light in the dark of, whatever's going on in your life, right? They will rush to add to it with whatever they can. And the thing is, it's just giving them that one little light, that tiny little spark to begin with, that I do think is an underrated thing to do when you're simply venting or talking about something bad that's happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a VTuber who's a good example of that. Pipkin Pippa, I think, would definitely.
Oh yeah, for sure, yeah.
Like millions of, maybe not millions, several hundreds of thousands of people have flocked to Pippa over the years, almost inspired by her kind of journey to get out of her malaise, I guess she kind of had at the beginning of her content creation journey. And
Pippa is she's the gremlin apotheosis, where she is slowly but surely fixing up various parts of her life, and that it's the kind of thing where you support in idol culture, where you support like someone on their path to becoming famous, but with Pippa it's just supporting her on her path to becoming healthy.
Yeah.
And it's being able to stick around for a creator that has gone through as many difficulties as she has, and yet is constantly able to just give her audience that little spark that they can add to. That's something that, yeah, you're absolutely right in that. I think Pippa is a great archetypical example of what I mean by giving your audience, leading by example when going through hardship, right? No. Or sharing hardship with your audience, I suppose.
So I guess we've spoken quite a lot about the bad things that we've seen in Vtubing, but what would you say how can you use social media to your advantage? What's examples of good use of social media for your branding?
That's also a good question, because there are a lot of things you can do with it. This may come off very cynical, mechanical, robotic even.
Very common one.
But with social media, you get the chance to, and this plays off of the whole premise of VTubing as a medium as well. You get to become something that is completely divorced to whatever limitations you have in real life. You can become whatever you like. You can portray yourself as whatever you like, and so long as you have the skills, the determination, the consistency, to continuously build on and reinforce that, you can turn yourself into whatever brand, whatever product, whatever mythical figure you like, right? And provided that you go at it with a sufficient degree of consistency and skill, so long as you are astute enough to pay attention to things like what audiences are looking for, content niches that haven't been completely filled yet, etc., you will be able to find supporters for that thing that you're trying to turn yourself into. So, to put it in a word, and this is going to sound quite cheesy, social media is one of the greatest enablers of self-expression that I think our species has ever had. And the reason why I love VTubing as a medium is because VTubing is completely built off of that premise that your online avatar does not need to be shackled to your real life identity. You can be whatever you want. You can be like, you can be a pink mold bunny, or you can be a talking chair, or you can be a slime slug girl, or whatever, right? It doesn't actually matter. just pick something and you have the tools in order to turn yourself into that something. It's this almost fascinating, it's how I imagine transhumanists feel in science fiction novels when they can augment their own bodies to create fantastical things that, are beyond the limitations of the human form. To put it in a bit of a pretentious way, but yeah,
That's good.
that's the kind of potential that I see in social media.
So, what do you think about guilt by association? If a content creator has, let's use Dr. Disrespect as an example. Let's say you're an orbiter. You are like a known associate, a collaboration partner of Dr. Disrespect, and he's had certain allegations made against him. What's the best way to handle that? What do you do?
What wouldn't you do? A few things actually. I would reach out to them behind the scenes, because the thing about guilt by association, especially when you combine it with the internet and Twitter especially, is that people can be very trigger happy when it comes to making judgments about developing situations.
Oh yes.
And the last thing you want to do is act like a snake, because if you just go nuclear instantly, right? You make up you basically write the equivalent of a twit longer. You post it. You disown any association with that person the moment that something comes out about them, and then later on it comes out that this was just somebody making something up, or it was completely unsubstantiated or whatever. Then you end up looking awful, and you've essentially exposed yourself as being someone who is extraordinarily easily swayed by public opinion and nothing else. So again, first thing I would do is try to review evidence, but also talk to them behind the scenes if possible. And then if it is the case that the evidence given is undeniable, they have admitted guilt, they've issued an apology, whatever, then depending on how bad the thing in question is, I'd probably just not associate with them either for a period of time onwards from there, or completely disassociate if it's something truly awful. It's really difficult to come up with a broad, an all-purpose, all cases strategy for how to handle that kind of stuff. Because generally, I'm not a big fan of guilt by association. If you continue to associate with someone even after a major revelation has come out, especially if those revelations have been substantiated by some sort of hard evidence, then that is very likely to be viewed as you making a statement rather than simply going with the flow or whatever. While I'm not a big fan of guilt by association, if it is something that bothers you, if you have been given hard evidence and good reason to believe that someone you previously associated with is a very unscrupulous person, then the best thing to do would probably be just to, if you're this is a very important thing. There will inevitably be people coming up to you to ask you to give some sort of statement about the situation as well, right?
Right.
And the most important thing to do is to discern whether the people asking you for a statement or some sort of input about the situation are from your community or just general audiences. Because you don't want to bother with general audiences. They don't really matter. If your community is starting to worry about, for want of a better way of putting it, your taste in character, right? Your ability to discern character. If your community, they don't like seeing you associate with somebody who is, for example, been proven to be a known sex pest or something, then I would probably have issue some sort of like brief explanation, like, don't worry, I've seen all the stuff, there's evidence, etc. So not really a big fan of, not be a big fan of collabing with them or anything. If it's like really necessary to make some sort of statement, otherwise I would just quietly stop associating with them. And I do feel like the quietly ceasing to associate with the party in question is probably the best thing to do 8 to 9 times out of 10.
I see. So you said there as well that the opinion of general audiences doesn't matter. If you could go into a bit more detail about that, why doesn't general audiences' opinions matter?
Mostly because you can't really define general audiences. And when you can't define a general audience, you can't shape your communications to fit whatever will get through to them. On top of that, in one of my previous streams, I think this was when I was breaking down Quinn Bennett's rant about things. I talked about how you can separate audiences, plural, into two groups. One being your community, and two just being an audience, right? One among many. And the difference between the two is that they have different expectations for how you're going to communicate with them. A community expects you to speak with them. So essentially what they're looking for is a dialogue where, they know you're listening and you know they're listening, and both of you listen to one another. An audience is different. They expect to be spoken at, right? And as a result of that, they also expect that when they also will interact with you more often than not by speaking at you. They can hear what you're saying, but the chances of them actually absorbing and actually listening to what you're saying are pretty low as a general rule. And the thing is, what I see a little too often for my liking is during times of public crisis, a creator will sort of twist themselves into pretzels trying to communicate with a general audience outside of their community while their community is sort of forced to watch. And that can be a very uncomfortable experience, right? You as a community member, you're kind of just in the cuck chair. So yeah, if you are, the reason why I would view general audiences as being, to put it in a crude way, less important and not matter, is because of the fact that communicating with a general audience is pretty much impossible anyways. The best you can do is put out a message and hope that the majority of them interpret it in the way that you meant it. But even that is a little bit of an ask, depending on which platform, how well you've worded it, and how high emotions are running surrounding the situation that you're trying to address.
It's something I see people struggle to handle sometimes. How would you advise, I guess, content creators establish boundaries with their community? Let's say, for example, you're a VTuber, you're uncomfortable with, your audience prying a bit too much into your personal life. Maybe they're making, the odd sexual joke that you don't appreciate. What's a clean way to communicate to them that you don't appreciate it without making you come across as, without you coming across the wrong way to them?
First of all, I would say look at whatever it is about your content that might encourage that. So make sure that it's not something that you're doing that is giving them that is, for want of a better way of phrasing it, throwing up a phantom green light for whatever behavior you'd like to get rid of.
Right.
And that does require you to be very, very honest with what you're doing in terms of your own content. But once you've done that, you've established that it's not actually something that you're doing, right?
Right.
Then I would say just articulating very clearly, but in a non-confrontational way. Look, I've been noticing this in my chat. It doesn't, I'm not very comfortable with this. And then reiterating what you would like to see in your chat. For example, something along the lines of, look, we talk about some pretty contentious topics here, but I've been noticing that, there have been some people coming in with looking to start fights, not really listening to what other people are saying. You need to be able to accept viewpoints that might be quite different to your own, at least hear them out, right? Never resort to name calling, etc., etc.
Yep.
Without targeting specific people just yet. You just put those rules out there. And then after that point, if you do get people who are blatantly disregarding whatever rules you set, the way that you solidify your boundaries is, well, in my opinion, it is to set examples, or, well, if you want to be very dictatorial, make examples out of people. And you usually want to, it's you usually don't want to be overly cruel in it, but you simply, you just, you can do this in any number of ways, right? You can do the Asmongold thing, where you pull them up on screen on stream and you show them off to everyone and go, look, this is what not to do, before you cut off their head or whatever.
Right.
Or you could just quietly just observe that something, someone's exhibiting behavior that you don't like to have in your chat, and you just ban them, right? And without saying anything, and everyone else in the chat will see that they're suddenly gone, and that will send a very clear message: we don't tolerate that kind of behavior here. But yeah, it's just mostly making sure that the first time you articulate that you're not comfortable with something, that you want to set a boundary, that you don't blame your audience, because again, that's the first time they're hearing about it. So not starting off accusatory is very important, and then afterwards, showing that boundary, making it clear through enforcement of your own rules, I would say.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. That's that's an interesting point you made there as well, in regards to thinking about the kind of content you do, and potentially, I guess, the kind of behaviors and audiences that might attract. I don't want to particularly get into the nitty-gritty of criticizing types of content, but one thing that I always find fascinating, however, one thing I always find fascinating, though, is the matter of girlfriend-boyfriend experience.
Yes.
When, unfortunately, the day happens, the Discord messages get leaked, a member of the opposite sex appears on screen, and then the audience has a complete meltdown. And the VTuber, I think sometimes they genuinely get confused as to why their audiences are having a meltdown.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what did you?
It's so strange. It's almost as if you sold yourself as being you sold yourself on the premise of being a product they can use as a substitute for company in their own lives.
That's exactly right. Perfectly well said. And they're like, they're shocked. They don't know why this is happening. And yeah, it just,
I really hate seeing like BFE, GFE streamers when they haven't set that clear boundary before the problem arises with their audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it is perfectly, it is possible to do like GFE, BFE content while also making it very clear to your audience, look, I'm making this content, I want you to enjoy it, but I don't want you to fall into the delusion of thinking that I am your girlfriend, or I am your boyfriend, or even I have a boyfriend, I have a girlfriend, I have a husband, I have a wife, right? That kind of stuff. But yeah, what I hate seeing is when none of that is done beforehand. The streamer actively encourages the formation of parasocial relationships among their audiences. And then when something happens and their audience reacts negatively, they start calling their audiences like incels and stuff. and that's always just such a, way to bite the hand that feeds, right? The hand, the hand that's tickling your chin that you're encouraging them to do, that kind of thing. It's just, it's always very, for want of a better word, cringe to watch.
Goodness, well said, absolutely. So yeah, my last question for you is: are you familiar at all with the Formula One driver Lewis Hamilton?
I'm not.
So he's an interesting figure. He's someone, I guess, with the closest thing you could, I guess, say to having almost perfect public relations. And the reason for that is he supports all the right causes. He doesn't say anything. He always takes the high road if people have an issue with him. He always conducts himself in a reasonable, mature manner. He literally always has his PR handler on his shoulder, kind of guiding him through media interviews. So despite having a very clean image where he doesn't do or say anything necessarily negative, he still gets quite a lot of negative publicity. For the major criticisms he receives is that people see him as being a very fake, overly clean corporate drone. So I think with public figures, you tend to find yourself in this weird situation where if you're a very strongly opinionated person, if you've got principles and you're not afraid to let people know them, obviously to think is to offend, right? So you're going to upset people, even if you have very lukewarm takes, shall we say. But if you choose to not, I guess, declare who you are and what you're about, then people will still hate you for it anyway. So, kind of, what is the winning play for a public figure? Do you try to get yourself? Do you try to manage a little bit of dirt on yourself, or do you just ignore it? Like, what should you do?
I recently saw a clip of Pippa talking about this, where I think the clip was titled something about Pippa and bad VTuber advice or something, where she was complaining about how it is a very common piece of advice that is thrown around in this space to be yourself, be authentic, be honest with and open with your audience, etc., right? And she criticized how common that was as a bit of advice and how that doesn't really work. And I'm inclined to agree with that, because the thing that audiences want, when an audience says that they want authenticity, what that tends to mean is they want consistency. And there is quite a bit of overlap between those two concepts, but they are not the same. They are not the same thing. Because authenticity means, to some degree, that you are providing something genuine, that you're providing something that's, honest, true, etc., etc. But with consistency, it's more about making sure that all of the individual bits of information that you've made available to your audience on, across whatever platforms they can find you on, or they can trace you back to, whatever accounts they can trace back to being you, right? Consistency means that when they take all those disparate pieces and put them together, it forms a coherent picture. And when audiences say they want authenticity, the reason why I say it often means more that they want consistency is because it doesn't really matter what you do. It doesn't matter, how dirty you like to get, what topics you like to tackle, whether you present yourself as an angel or an asshole. It just has to do with making sure that whatever whatever image you convey to your audience, it all makes sense at the end of the day, right? This comes back to the whole treating yourself like a product that you've made for an audience type thing, where consistency guarantees that they get what they signed up for, right? Whatever you projected is whatever they're going to get. And when it comes to the winning play for a public figure, what I would say is it makes sure that you are consistent, that when someone looks at, let's say, for example, how you behave on Twitter, it isn't really different to the way that you behave on YouTube or Twitch or Kick or whatever, right? And making sure that there are no parts of yourself that you put out in a place where your audience can access that end up creating dissonance with another part of yourself that you put out on a different platform or whatever. That is the key to making sure that your audience will feel comfortable liking you and your content, even if you are not, quote unquote, squeaky clean, right? Because more often than not, audiences don't tend to mind if you are somewhat more down and dirty in your conduct or in your content. It just needs to all make sense, right? For example, if you're someone who's built your brand on going to town on other creators, like being a really harsh critic, for example, and you backtrack the moment you receive a little bit of pushback from a creator that is slightly larger than you, well, there you go, right? Your audience is going to have their immersion, the illusion broken, and just like that, your brand, which was, it could have worked despite being not the cleanest. Now it no longer works because you've introduced a little bit of dissonance between what your audience expects and what you've given them.
I see.
Same thing with if you just made all of your content like cozy zatsus on YouTube, for example, and then when they go over to your Twitter, you're ranting about how you're ranting about your political opinions, or you're wishing death upon everyone who didn't vote the same as you, right? So yeah, it's more a consistency than authenticity per se, and that I would say that's the That's the best way of ensuring that you've built yourself up in a way that is, well, while I'm not going to claim that it'll allow you to avoid criticism, it'll make you resilient to criticism, or more resilient to criticism, I would say.
No, that makes sense. I think, yeah, I think you're right. With the problem is with saying just be yourself is that if you are yourself, well, you may not be the kind of person that people like, or you might not be a particularly entertaining person if you just be yourself. Certainly,
Exactly.
exactly. If I were myself on stream, I wouldn't say anything. I'd be a completely grey, corporate type, right? When I'm not VTubing, I don't say a word to anyone unless I'm spoken to, right? And that's not a particularly engaging attitude, to have, right? So
I'm pretty much the same.
yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty non-verbal when I'm off stream as well.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I think with some people, I'm normally an introvert, but something about VTubing just encourages, the complete opposite almost. It's not a conscious thing, if you know what I mean. It's almost like, I don't know, just streaming, just it's like
yeah. For me, it's this sensation of, oh, okay, time for me to put on a performance, right? Take on a role. I have information I want to give to an audience, and I need to present it to them in a way that makes it worth their time, right? It's a nice challenge or prompt that gets me going.
Yeah, exactly. It's a challenging balancing act, isn't it? It's about it's about trying to find. It's in a sense, it kind of is being yourself, because it should ideally be like your genuine creativity and passion. You should come into content creation thinking, what do I have to offer that audiences, might like, and then what's the best way to deliver that? But then at the same time, you have to consider, as we've said before, about how it might come across, about miscommunicating things, which can lead to negative publicity. I think, realistically speaking, human beings aren't perfect creatures. We've all got our vices, we've got our problems, our insecurities, but you don't want people to know that stuff, even though it might be understandable and reasonable. You want to keep that stuff, out of the, you want to keep that out of the public eye and just concentrate on the positive things that you can offer people as a content creator, I guess. And I think it's the thing with hags, right? Hags are very popular VTubing fans, and it's like, why are hags popular? Probably because they've got a lot of life experience. They've probably got a lot of work experience. So they've spent a lot of time, speaking with all different characters and, working their corporate jobs in real life. And that probably helps them understand what is and isn't appropriate behavior and language when speaking to people. Whereas if you're you're a new VTuber, you're 18, 19 years old, you've never had a job before, you've just graduated from high school, you're still quite young and immature, and you haven't really, I guess, properly developed those, I guess, filters that stop you from getting into trouble.
I mean, it's the difference between being terminally online and being chronically online, right?
Absolutely. So let's talk about you a little bit more. Let's know more about yourself. So what is it about public relations that interested you in the first place?
Well, I mean, come from a media and communications background. That's the degree that I chose to scam myself with when I enrolled in university.
Right.
And of all the units that I took, public relations was the one that sort of, how do I say? It was one of the units that struck me as both, I suppose, morbidly interesting, because a lot of public relations, as we get taught in university, is to do with manipulating public opinion in various different ways. And as a result, when I started looking at the VTubing, well, not even just the VTubing space, but I started looking around at, media organizations, legacy media, advertising campaigns, how corporations would try to communicate with their consumers, etc., etc. It was kind of it was a situation where, now that I'd been given eyes to see, I could see the all the theories and stuff I'd been taught being used pretty much everywhere that I looked. While public relations is admittedly not my favorite, or the part of a media degree that I'm personally most interested in, the thing that drew me to actually start using that knowledge, I suppose, in the form of content, not just having it rattle around in my own head, was the fact that I could see it pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny, isn't it, as well? I think how sometimes VTubing, just something about it just almost gives people that inspiration to take those thoughts and those passions they have in their head and actually go out there and actually, make content out of it, actually produce it into something real and tangible that people can consume.
For sure. I mean, with VTubing especially, it's such a new and yet, well, relatively speaking, new yet, to use a bit of a tired word, diverse industry where there's so much room for so many different people who, have different areas of knowledge and expertise, etc., to just come in and contribute something that, yeah, it's a nice sort of a nice melting pot of a bunch of different, niches that haven't even been explored yet.
No, absolutely. So, what's your experience in the industry? Is it just relating to an academic background, or do you have work experience in the way of PR as well?
It is mostly academic. I did do a brief stint helping a state-sponsored media org with a problem that they were having when it came to reaching younger audiences. So, but that's about it, pretty much.
And what made you interested in VTubing? What is it that attracted you to the field?
It's funny to think about now, but React videos.
React videos, interesting.
Yeah. I started off, well, it's a mixture of curiosity and spite. I started off watching VTubers because at the time I was just, I was floating around through the internet. I was in the mood for having a little bit of, simulated social affirmation. So I just, I'd look up React videos to, other content that I watched that I really liked, etc., etc. And quite a few of these React videos were VTubers. So that's how I started. That's how I was first exposed to VTubing as an industry. And then after that, I started consuming clips from people like Low Effort Clips, Azahara. The first VTuber, the first batch of VTubers that I actually watched, like the content of, not just them staring at someone else's video that's playing, was a Face Connect, right? It was Pipkin, Pippa, no, Face Connect and Kirsha, pretty much. So I started watching clips, then I started watching streams, and then after that, that was me dipping my toes into this space. And then at the beginning of this year, Selengate happened. The whole Niji debacle happened. And at that point, it was such a disaster. And it was such an egregious violation of all of the ethics and practices that I had been taught over the course of my degree, that I was craving a video just ripping apart what Anycolor and Niji was trying to do when they set out to not only terminate a talent, but smear her name as well. And when I looked around, I didn't really see any other videos that scratched that itch. So I just decided to make it myself. And from that moment on, I was sort of, I was not just dipping my toes in, I was just thoroughly immersed in the whole the industry in general. But yeah. So curiosity and spite.
Oh, no, that's absolutely interesting. Yeah, I think you're particularly right as well about, I guess, scratching an itch and going into diving deeper into the nitty gritty as to what the issue with Selengate was. I think when it comes to VTuber commentary channels, we've got all sorts of channels, everything from drama channels to news channels. And I think for the most part, most people, they're kind of, I guess, they scratch the surface and they give people, I guess, the general breakdown of what's going on. But I think in the VTubing commentary sphere, I think we're kind of lacking people who have some kind of what's the word, sort of an academic background, or as sort of a work experience background in, I guess, corporate level subjects like, business management and public relations. So I think, yeah, you coming along when you did to provide something a bit more, I guess, a bit more specific, a bit more detailed was very good for the community as well. It was a form of education that I think we were kind of lacking to help us understand exactly what the issue with Niji Sanji's management and handling of its talents at the time was.
I really appreciate that. That's very affirming to hear. Um, yeah, I feel like this year has the events that have transpired over the course of this year alone have created openings for so many different types of new creators, I suppose. Not necessarily VTubers, but also VTuber adjacent creators to sort of enter this particular this space, which it's been quite fascinating to watch as well. As someone who was, albeit kind of briefly, consuming VTuber content prior to 2024 as well.
No, absolutely, you're right. We've seen so many new great debuts. We've got new powerhouses rising, and of course, people, I guess, sometimes talk about how VTubing is oversaturated, and that's not necessarily something I agree with. Actually, I mean, we've got veterans leaving. Sadly, corporations, going into decline, terminating operations, and yeah, I think there's still a lot more space in certain sectors of VTubing for new faces to appear.
Yeah, on that, I would say we're agreed.
So is there anything special you'd like to achieve as a VTuber? Sort of what are your goals?
I would. That's a good question, actually. When I started making content, when I committed to doing streams as regularly as I could, the thing that I wanted to be able to impart, I suppose, was just a bit more knowledge. I wanted to take the concepts, some of the principles, the ethics, values, training that I'd received during my time at university, and essentially just try to make as much of that free as possible. Mostly because I resent my university for charging me as much money to teach me as well. If I'm being completely honest, knowledge that isn't really that. I mean, this was all stuff that you could probably learn by doing a few days of Googling, reading through academic papers, etc., just looking on your own. But yeah, that was my original goal, was to just try and turn my knowledge into as much of a public utility as possible. But now I've gotten myself some more ambitious goals, I suppose. I want to be able to achieve. I'm under no delusion that I can change things like corporate standards or professional codes of ethics in the major companies or whatever. But I do hope that my content, the ultimate aim of my content, is to help move the needle a little bit in this industry towards a higher standard of professionalism, I suppose. Through a combination of making audiences more aware, better equipped to articulate the things that might bother them, better equipped to spot things like unethical media practice and corporate statements, for example, and also hopefully to give a little bit of free advice to other creators who wish to treat this as a job, not a hobby.
One thing I find very interesting in particular is, I guess, the standard of public announcements that corporations are making. We've got some VTuber corporations which are trying to be serious and they have quite a lot of money behind them. And some of the stuff they come up with, sometimes the way they treat talents, their public statements is quite shocking, really. I mean, you don't even need to be someone who's familiar with public relations to look at the statements and think, what on earth is this person thinking? Like, who thinks this is okay?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, something I've reiterated several times before in my content is people aren't stupid, right? You don't need to pay money for a media degree in order to understand when you're reading something that's designed to be manipulative or deceptive or dishonest in some way.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, audiences are hyper aware of that. My aim is to just give more, access to more technical words, concepts, jargon, whatever that helps them to describe that, verbalize that better.
A special thank you to Armchair for his time. I hope you found this session interesting. You should check out Armchair's latest stream, a retrospective on VShojo's toxic relationship with Twitter. In the next episode, I'll be interviewing VTuber Minna Vanilla on her experiences with Flavor, the meme AI corporation made by Pipkin Pippa, and Minna's journey as a content creator, mother, and baker.